Welcome to the Brick and Mortar podcast, where we discuss all things commercial real estate with top industry professionals. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Brandon Isner. Brandon is a leading voice in retail thought leadership and currently serves as a research leader at Newmark. Brandon's insights will help us unpack the forces reshaping retail today. If you're ready to learn from one of the top minds in retail research, stay tuned. Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Shanice. No, I'm glad to be here. It's an exciting time for retail and lots of things going on, especially heading into the holiday season. So yeah, I'm happy to be here and happy to discuss it.
Could you start by sharing a bit about your journey in retail research and what led you to specialize in this area?
Sure. So I started in the commercial real estate research industry about 10 years ago. I have degrees from college in urban studies and in urban planning, and within a lot of that, there's statistical analysis and there's also real estate finance, and that's really what got me into like the data analysis and being able to look at seas of information and be able to tell stories from that, and that's essentially what I do is, and a lot of people that are in my role, we're essentially storytellers. We take the facts and make it interesting enough that people will listen. And I'm being a little bit kidding, but at the same time, there's also a heavy responsibility because there's a lot of people that look to our reports or our analysis of reports and invest a lot of money. So it's a fun job, but it's something I take seriously. But real estate has always been a hobby of mine. Like even as a kid, I would always try to sneak into open houses in my neighborhood for everybody else would be riding bikes and jumping off ramps, and I'd be like touring the other houses in my neighborhood. So yeah, so it's kind of come full circle, and so again, I've been within research for 10 years, and about 3 years ago, I started focusing on just the retail aspect of it, and I enjoy it. I think retail is fascinating because it's not just a commercial real estate type. It's also as a society, as we as a whole, we spend a lot of time there. It's one of the few commercial real estate types where people actually choose to spend their spare time. And a lot of us have a lot of memories about places like the Gen X with the malls, and a lot of people had their first dates at a retail center or meet friends at a restaurant in a retail center. And so there's just a lot of times that we connect with retail as just as human beings, and so I find that all really fascinating.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the current retail landscape?
Well, it's right now and I think there's a lot of times where people are surprised at this, but retail assets as a whole, like all the retail real estate as a whole, it's in very solid it's in a very solid situation right now. We're near, if not at, we're near record lows in availability across the U.S. for retail centers. Rents continue to increase. There's a lot of demand. Sometimes there might be some retail centers that might be a little bit behind. They're struggling, but all the top malls and all the retail real estate that are in hot areas, it's just never been hotter. And a lot of retailers are look that are in expansion mode look to those types of areas to locate, and so the space just has gotten really tight. And I find that really interesting. And then on top of that, all the retail that's around today, there's very little danger of new competition coming into the market because construction costs remain restrictively high, and retail rents aren't at the place where you can justify new construction, because retail's kind of unique because you can't build 10, 20, 30 stories like you can with a with an apartment building or with an office building. And so the financial spreadsheet really needs to make sense to develop. And so there's just been very little development, over the last 4 or 5 years. And so that's just enabled the market to get really tight. So it might be a little bit more challenging for retailers to find space, but certainly the landlords of retail real estate, they're happy about it.
Yeah. Do you think the recent election results have an influence? Or, sorry, let me rephrase that question. How does this week's election influence your perspective? Does it change at all?
It doesn't really change on top in regard to the real estate assets, the actual real estate. It's going to remain tight. Um, in regard to the top trade areas, it's gonna be very difficult to find space. Um, One thing that could happen, I know that there's been some talk about the potential tariffs and that could raise prices, but that's something that really it's going to need to be a kind of wait and see thing because prices within the U.S. there's such a wide range already. A burger in Oklahoma is going to be a different price than a burger in New York City, and it's sometimes wildly so. And so that's always an interesting thing, which each state has a lot of times their own prices on things. So it's not something where you can say, oh, look, this is going to raise the price of everything 10%. It usually doesn't happen that way. And so, but that said, it's obviously with any election, things generally change, and so we'll have to see wait going forward. One thing that I think is interesting is that uh, if you look at consumer sentiment, and I like to use the source of the University of Michigan consumer sentiment, which it goes back to the 1960s, 1950s. And what's really interesting is right now, sentiment for current conditions is lower than sentiment for future. And so that's very rare that's like that. Usually, current conditions are held at a higher regard for the future, and so now it's reversed. So I think that there's a lot of people that and again, that was done before the election, but I think that there's a lot of people that feel that we've been in this era of high inflation for a while, and that finally inflation's starting to come down, and wage growth is back above the inflation growth rate. And so I think that people just have a little bit more spending power with their dollars now. And so I think that election or not, I think people are looking for the future are they're going to be better times.
Yeah. So the Feds just recently dropped interest rates another 0.25 basis. How has that cut, how will it influence retail real estate investments?
Well, one thing it does is it creates more of a spread between cap rates and then what the borrowing what they can borrow money at, and so that could eventually be a good thing. One thing that's retail investment sales for retail have been fairly low for a while, but they're starting to creep back up a little bit. If you look at multi-tenant centers, there's activity for them has risen the last couple quarters, not by a lot, but at least it's a positive trend. And I think that there's such a secure asset, and there's no danger of competition, and even the CEOs of real estate, retail real estate trusts admit that building new is just it's very restrictive in a lot of environments, so in a lot of markets, and so there's just very little threat from new competition. So I think that we'll see a lot of a lot of new sources of capital coming back into retail. So right now, retail is dominated by private capital. And but I can see that, over the next, several years, maybe some of that institutional capital, maybe some REITs, maybe some pension funds, they'll start looking back into retail as a steady place for their money.
Beyond the current moment, I want to talk about how we got here. So, in terms of legislative or economic shifts, what factors do you think have played the biggest role in affecting new retail developments over the past decade?
I don't think it's really even been. I honestly, I just think it's a factor of just what's been going on just within society. So, uh, leading up to the great financial crisis, in 2008 through 2010, however you date it, uh, leading up to that, we had several years where retail deliveries were way above where the absorption would be. So the absorption wasn't even covering the new product that was being put into place. And so that's when a lot of the dialogue started emerging where the US is overbuilt on retail and we've just got too much retail. And so that built up, and then suddenly we had the great financial crisis. And so then everything just fell off. But then at that same time, that's when you started to have the rise of e-commerce, when it really started to emerge as a real big, oh, this isn't a trend, it's not going away, this is a real thing. And so you had two different factors against construction. You had this idea that the US is overbuilt on retail, and then, oh, everyone's just going to be buying things online within the next several years. And so what happened is that retail development just fell off a cliff, and it's been very low since then. There was a slight bump in the mid 2010s when retail was a big part of a lot of mixed use development, but really there hasn't been any significant retail development since in like 10, 15 years. It's been below 1% of new supply every year. And so that's really allowed the quarterly absorption to stay above that line of new development. And so it's really just enabled that availability rate to fall. And so, now we're at a level where we kind of do need new real estate for retailers that want to expand, but building in the areas where they want to expand, it's very restrictive because it's going to be expensive. And so that's also encouraged, the redevelopment of existing retail sites, or the reimagining of retail sites. So, there's been some malls where I'm not sure if you've heard the term like demalling a retail site, where it's a big mall, but you kind of make it into an open air center. And so you might actually reduce the overall square footage, but it might reinvigorate the space. And maybe you also build an apartment building or a hotel or something and kind of make it a mixed use development, just to kind of get, refire that retail and make it relevant again. So we are seeing a lot of that. Um, there's Yeah, I was just reading, an earnings call for one of the REITs, and they're saying that within their pipeline of development, that about a third of it is based on residential that they're going to mix in with their current retail. And so again, I don't think that I've gone a long way on that rant, but it's not necessarily a government thing that's really come across. It's just that it just reached a point where it was better for developers to build multifamily or industrial or office space, and so it just retail just kind of fell out of favor. But as we're finding out now, that might have been a good thing.
Yeah. Apart from demalling, which is so interesting, what are some other creative ways you've seen retailers adapt to or repurpose existing spaces to meet demand?
I think that there's been some, that's actually a good question. So. Uh, we've seen in the news that there's been a lot of retail closures. Obviously the Bed Bath and Beyond situation is still on the top of a lot of people's minds, even though that was almost a couple years ago now. But what has happened is that it's not only reimagining the center as a whole, but reimagining the space. So Bed Bath and Beyond, they actually had quite a bit of demand for those boxes, but in the areas where they didn't, sometimes the landlords would go in and they would break it up into maybe two or three or maybe even four separate spaces that might be easier to lease. And so their center wouldn't be so dependent upon finding 25,000 square foot tenant, but instead could find four different ones that are like 6 to 7,000 square feet or less. And so that's been interesting to see some of the breakup of that kind of space. And then another one I think that's kind of interesting is that um, the pandemic. I know everybody's sick of talking about the pandemic and hearing about it, but I think it's still really interesting, and I you don't hear this a lot, uh actually a good friend of mine back in Miami, we would discuss this all the time, but leading up into the pandemic, everybody lived and worked with habits that were established in a pre-internet age. We use the internet as a tool, but it didn't really envelop our lives. But now, after the pandemic, retail was among the first to like shift to this new reality just because it had to. Suddenly within 3 to 4 weeks, grocery stores were selling their had curbside pickup and third party delivery rather than people coming into the stores, and suddenly quick service restaurants instead of inside the dining room dining, you suddenly just had everybody just coming through the drive-through, and that gummed up the streets because there's just so many people waiting. And so I think some of the construction that we've seen since then, where retailers are kind of embracing this idea where people they shop on apps more than ever before. In fact, Adobe Analytics, they estimate that in 2024, 53% of all online purchases will be made on a mobile device. And so when you think about that and you think about people being on the move rather than sitting at their house in front of their desktop computer buying things, I think that kind of signaled retail properties that, hey, we need to redesign our space to account for this. And so we've seen that, right? Like in a lot of the quick service or fast food restaurants, whatever you call them, a lot of them have multiple drive-throughs now for you have a drive-through for on-site orders, but you might have an entirely separate drive-through for app orders and third-party delivery orders that have already been put in. So they're essentially just picking it up. And grocery stores have this too, especially urban grocery stores where, sure, you have everything that's in the store, but you might have a whole shelf, a whole section in the store that's just for picking up the orders that you ordered online that were picked for you. And so I think that's been really interesting. And if you think about how quickly the build out of these stores had to change to meet all this. I think it's fascinating, and there's still a long way to go with things like this. Like there's been a lot of surveys about this, but for the most part, they all agree that around 50% or higher of online shoppers, so people that buy things online, if they have to return those items, they prefer to return them in store versus mailing it back through. And so that's yet another role that the store has to take on, where they have to think about this reverse logistics and how to handle smoother these returns, because that's actually a good situation for a retailer. They would rather have you come to the store to return it because maybe they have one more chance to make a sale rather than just have a dissatisfied customer. So again, like it's not just the outside development that's changing, which it is, and there's a lot more mixed use development going on, but it's also the in-store build-outs and development that's changing, and retailers are spending more money developing space that's more dedicated to multi-channel retailing than just being a place to buy stuff. So that I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. For example, I can return my Amazon order at my local Whole Foods now.
Yeah.
Know of any other brands who have similarly like accommodated both online and in-person shopping? And if so, how?
I mean there's not as much of a of an example as that, but I think that everybody's grocery store now has mobile orders. Like I so I'm back in Cleveland, and there's a great local grocer here, and it's not even that big of a company, but they operate their own picking system where if you order online, they do it themselves, and then they will either deliver it to you, or they'll have it where you can pick it up there. And so I think that that's just going forward. That's almost a must have. It's almost table stakes that you need to have to do something like that. There's been some news lately where Sam's Club, they have a new prototype that they're building. I forget exactly where it's located, but where they're gonna basically triple the amount of space that's dedicated to handling multi-channel orders. And so I think a lot of other retailers are going to start thinking about this as well. Maybe even to the point to have some type of distribution facility at their store or their center as well. Not like a million square feet like we see like out in the along the highways, but still just this idea of being able to fulfill orders faster and more efficiently, because you know, more and more online orders are being fulfilled in store rather than just straight from a distribution facility. So that's something that almost all retailers need to be thinking about, at least ones that want to maintain that multi-channel platform. There was one more thing. There was a great report a couple years ago by Forrester, and they studied 60 different multi-channel retailers. And they found that if you were to take just the curbside pickup aspect of online shopping and attribute that to the store sales, they would elevate it on average by 11%. So that's a lot of online orders that are being picked up at store. And so again, I think that's you asked me to name a retailer. I mean, pretty much every retailer that wants to have that kind of a seamless multi-channel platform will be needing to do that.
Yeah. So it seems that we have two popular routes that retailers are taking in response to the competitive environment. On one hand, we have retailtainment, which is building your retail space around an experience. Like I read an article about Marvel's Avengers pop-up in Las Vegas.
Cool.
On the other hand, we have the classic e-commerce route. Do you think that's accurate, or are there other avenues that retailers can pursue to find value in a brick and mortar location?
I think that there's a lot of going back to I keep saying going back to stores, but honestly, it's not going back to stores. People have always gone to stores. And you have two separate categories. You have convenience versus entertainment versus just social settings. And retail can handle both of those. It's like I'd mentioned earlier in regard to retail centers just being a place where a lot of us spend our spare time. There's a cafe a few blocks away from my house that they all know me, like because I'm there all the time. If I just want to get some fresh air and take a walk around the block, and so there's that. But then on the same point, there's a lot of marketing plans out there to kind of reintroduce people to a place like a mall, and just how great of a place it is to meet people and just find a lot of things to do at once. Malls kind of became a bad word there for a while, but a lot of malls have, especially the class A and up malls, they've re-tenanted themselves in really interesting ways, and so there are a lot of things to do at these malls. And that's another thing where before, back in my heyday, most malls were they're all apparel and whatnot. In fact, the mall that I Chapel Hill Mall, which doesn't exist anymore, which that was my mall growing up. There were only three places to get something to eat in the entire mall. And now that's, there's definitely, there's usually a food court, but then there'll also be other restaurants all over the place. And so that's a new thing. Like just restaurant spending alone it's like 12 or 13% of total retail sales now. And that's an all-time high. Um, so clearly, that's a service and it's event and it's something fun to do. And so that's something that, retail centers have built in. But at the same time, you're right. They absolutely also have to think of the idea that they're competing with the convenience of online shopping. And then that kind of goes back to the point about, so many people are on their mobile devices now to buy things. So it's also important if, maybe not for a destination type retail, but for just a convenience type retail, you want to have easy in and out. You want to have lots of parking right close to the shop. You just want to run and pick it up, drive out. And so I think it's a mix of both things. And uh, convenience retail, like the smaller retail centers that just have like your kind of everyday things um like a phone store or a convenience store, things like that. They've become really popular as well. Just in regard to investment, and it's very easy to re-tenant, and they're not dependent upon big box stores to keep their revenue stream. And so we've seen a lot of that as well, where those smaller centers, they kind of function as your everyday convenience, easy in and out. And a lot of them aren't trying to be a destination. They're just trying to be a convenience in our lives that can compete with the ease of e-commerce. But not everybody likes e-commerce, and also e-commerce is very expensive. And so, sometimes it's better to have that convenient retail just nearby where they don't worry about the dwell times. And in fact, if the dwell times are high, then they're not doing their job right. So that's another thing too, that you can have retail functioning on both sides of that equation.
Yeah. In recent years, we've seen the clear economic incentive to build sustainably. Amid that trend, are you noticing a push for eco-friendly or green retail developments? Are regulatory pressures increasing to encourage sustainability in CRE? And what does this mean for retailers?
For developers, there have been some things like I've noticed more attention to places like parking lots, to have places where there's water retention areas, or more tree coverage, uh, maybe using reclaimed materials, things like that. For retailers, it doesn't matter as much as it does for the owner side, at least not that I've seen. Although there are some retail brands that's part of their brand culture about sustainability and being friendly to the environment. And so what you'll see with a lot of those types of retailers is, you're right, that they'll try to reuse elements within their store to kind of highlight that's part of their approach. Um, this happens a lot with high street retail and street retail as a whole, where there's fewer stores, so they can take time to design them, each one of them unique, and you'll see things like that where they might use reclaimed wood railings, or keep the integrity of the historic building they're in, and not try to paint over the original iron aspects, but they'll highlight that, or the polished stone floors. They'll try to highlight things like that. So but the thing is, unfortunately with retail, that there's a lot of times there's big parking lots, and it can be a little tough to to redo those without spending a lot of money on it. But it definitely is on the thoughts of a lot of people, especially investors, especially overseas investors. The one good thing about retail is that, again, there's just not a lot of it being built, and usually when it is built or redone, it's on an infill site that's already been there. And so I think in the 80s, we definitely saw a lot of those outlet centers being built out in the middle of, a field or, of a more green belt area, but there's very little of that being done now. I think that, for the most part, retail has basically kept the same footprint that it has for years. So yeah, again, to wrap it all up, that there's, a little bit I think we've seen, but it's a little tougher because with retail, you can't exactly build vertically. Maybe 2 stories, 3 stories at the most. And so a lot of times it does take up a lot of space. But for the most part, I think there's been some owners that are they're trying to do the right thing and infuse the sites with more environmentally friendly materials.
That's great. As we approach the holidays, we can obviously expect supply chains to be challenged, and holiday spending is expected to hit a record $902 per person, which I actually saw in your weekly newsletter, which is amazing, by the way.
Thank
Do
you.
you think that 902 figure is about consumer confidence or is it inflation?
It's probably a mixture of both, but one of the interesting things is that for the last inflation is still an issue. The prices are still higher than they were pre-pandemic, but for the last 4 quarters or so, wage growth has been back above year-over-year inflation growth, and so there has been a little bit more spending power back in the hands of consumers, and so I think that's that could play a part. There's another thing too, and there's obviously there's always there are always going to be barriers, and not everybody's alike. But I think that people that bought homes pre-pandemic uh, or might have had assets on the stock market or something like that, a lot of them have ended up seeing their net worth increase a significant amount since then. And so a lot of them, you might have more equity in your house, or if you bought your car, then you have almost equity in your car. Sometimes you can get a lot more than you thought when you turn cars in. But so there's that as well. So it's definitely, things have definitely been a challenge for people that on the lower end of the income spectrum. A lot of those incomes actually grew at a higher level than the others for a while, but really inflation was just kind of tough on that. But again, that said, I think that going into this holiday season, it's that it always draws some excitement from people, and to be fair, I think that in years past, there's there's been a higher prediction of growth than there is this year. I think that if you take all factors into account, I think the average rate of increase is around 3.5, 3.6, 3.7% year over year. And then on top of that, we also have a shorter holiday season traditionally because Thanksgiving and Christmas are a little bit closer together. But that said, there's people start their shopping for the holidays, all holidays, a lot earlier than they used to. October is a big month now, and it's again, I think that a lot of it has to do with that idea where inflation's finally coming down a little bit. If again, if you look at the consumer the consumer confident index, a lot of people are more optimistic about the future, and so I think that that's probably what's driving that.
What shopping trends are you seeing emerge from your research, and how are retailers adjusting their strategies to meet these trends?
So that's a pretty good question. So the thing that just comes off the top of my head is that I recently ran by category for my recent quarterly deck, by store type on year both month over month and year over year growth in sales. And what's interesting is that the miscellaneous stores category is the leader of both year over year growth and month over month growth. And so if you think about miscellaneous stores, a lot of that pet supplies. A lot of it is, some of those, some of those, resale outlet stores, but a lot of them are secondhand stores. So again, I think that people are being the one thing about spending is it's kind of, it's kept up, but at the same time, people are being more deliberate with their spending purchases. Where, in the past, um, here's a funny example for me. I just found out the other day that I still have a health club membership down in Miami, and I didn't realize that I didn't cancel it. So that is not smart. And so I think that consumers are being smarter with every single dollar, and they're kind of they're watching it a little bit more. Like in the past, people might have purchased three iced lattes in a day, and it's like, well, wait a second, that's $15 a day. Maybe I should turn that, pull that back a little bit. And so they might still spend, but they'll just be more careful on where that's going. And so again, um, uh, miscellaneous stores, obviously, pets are included with that. And a lot more people have pets, but the idea of like, bargain outlets or secondhand stores being a part of growth, I think is really interesting. And then, another thing is that, another one of the high growth categories year over year is the non-store retail, which that includes e-commerce. And so if you look at there's been, and I don't remember the exact source, but if any of your listeners have a question that maybe I can look it up after they can contact me. But there's this source that showed inflation. And as it turns out, inflation for online stores has not been as severe as it's been for in-store shopping. And so I think that that's where a lot of people have turned to, just like a lot of people have turned to warehouse clubs, and they're saving money by buying in bulk rather than buying it at a traditional grocery store, or even like a superstore. And uh, so again, I think that just people are just more deliberate. They want their dollars to stretch as far as they can, and I think that we'll see that. We're seeing that in the numbers, and again, going back to it, we'll also see it in the holiday season.
Yeah. So you specialize in retail thought leadership. What do you think about data-driven solutions in the industry, whether for improving site selection, finding work, or even inventory decisions?
It's the basis of everything. You there's more data available now than ever before, and I'll just take an example. I kind of touched on this earlier, but retailer, back in the 80s or the 90s, if they wanted to enter a market, they might have and they wanted to enter the market strong, they might have opened up 10 stores immediately in the market. But now they can go to location intelligence. They can get location intelligence on what their store's about, where their likely customers are located, and so they can find out that, look, you can open up these 10 stores if you want, but if you could also open up just these six stores and have the exact same trade area coverage as you would with these other 10, because these will be located more efficiently and in better areas. And so um, you might end up paying more for that space, but again, it might be more efficient for just your overall operations. And everybody always concentrates on retail sales, but operational expenses are very important too. And so you always need to balance that. And so that's something that retailers absolutely use. And then on the flip side of that, the developers use that as well. Like, if we develop this space, how long will it take to get our, to recoup our investment from that, with rents and everything. And again, that's what's made it so challenging for new retail development. And that's kind of what's held off a lot of new retail developers, because they've seen that, that the rents in place just aren't adequate enough to cover what their expense on construction would be, which has risen considerably since 2019. Construction costs are up 50-60% since before the pandemic, which is crazy. So it's made it even more of a challenge. But yeah, data is behind everything, and we have more access to more data than ever before. And that's why I think that's why I take my job seriously, and I think a lot of us at at Newmark take our job seriously because that's our job is to take this data and come up with the best solutions possible. And it's scary sometimes, but give your opinion on what someone should do. And then on the flip side, for investors, they've if it's a REIT, they have investors with them that also want to know why they made this decision. And so you better have data to back that up, whether you bought a center or you sold a center, just to let your investors know that that was the right decision. So it encompasses everything that we do, and that's why it's always important to have the best data possible.
Right. What do you think about mixed use developments as an effective solution for both retail and combating the housing shortage?
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think I mentioned earlier that there's there's a lot of retail REITs out there that are finding places that they could potentially create a mixed use environment out of one of their centers. I think a lot of this is going to come from some of the sales of the big box retailers. That's because it's not exactly a secret. Macy's has announced that they're going to close up to 150 locations of underperforming stores. And so a lot of those spaces will have those boxes are big enough where there's enough land where you could potentially make create an apartment building or a hotel or even office. That's something that a lot of people forget is like that there's with a lot of these mixed use retail centers, it becomes an ideal place to have office space. Because if you have people come into your office, it's an easy place to get out of the office and go have something to eat or go to lunch, or there's always plenty of parking. And so that's that happens as well. There's several cases where there's office being developed in some of these rising mixed use communities. So but retail is always the centerpiece. It goes back to that original thing where retail is part of who we are as a society, and it's everything else can benefit from being close to it.
Yeah. So, my last question for you, where should consumers and industry professionals be directing their attention to prepare for the ever-shifting retail and CRE landscapes? And is there anything that might surprise people?
Wow, that's a big question. So, one thing I have a couple answers to that. So, again, one thing that I think has been really interesting is seeing the just the transformation of like some of these struggling retail sites into a retail site that's more in tune with how commerce and e-commerce in society works today. Like I've seen some cases where they'll take like a mall that's been empty for a while, but redevelop it into a whole bright new center with that there might be a grocery anchored center, and it might be less overall space, but it's more attuned to how people shop. So developers are doing that for the people. Retail is that one property type where you can't you have to cater to the consumer because they're going to have a lot of other choices, and so it's always good. There's always going to be thought behind the people that live there and what they're doing and how they go about their lives. And so it's people kind of hold a lot of power with that. And just like we've seen one of the recent trends, well, it's not that recent anymore, but for the last 7 to 8 quarters, suburban retail assets have had a lower availability rate than retail spaces in urban areas, and that's the first time ever that that's happened. And that's a case of that kind of that net migration that we saw back out to the suburbs when a lot of the cities were locked down. And not to say that the cities are going anywhere. In fact, a lot of the high street areas in the country have never been better. The Miami Design District, Fifth Avenue, New York, or Rodeo Drive in LA. But that said, that influx of new residents into the suburbs, that spurred kind of a run to the suburbs as well for retailers. And so you suddenly had retailers thinking, well, maybe I don't have to be in a storefront or in a mall. Maybe I can just move into this open air center out in this suburb, and maybe that'll work well for my business. Um, and you know, and we've seen that across the board. There's a lot of retailers that have kind of shifted their target for where they're going to put their store to a whole new place, and it's worked out very well for them. And so that's, that's the thing. It's, retail's ever changing, and it has to change because, again, ultimately people are what drive it. And people can quickly make up their mind when, what they're, where they're going to shop. And so you always want to stay on top of everything. Just one last thought for this. I think it's interesting sometimes when you'll see a mall and you'll see a store close, and but it's say it's the top mall in the area, and then the store closes, and people might be upset about that, and they say, well, that store's been there for 30 years. I can't believe that it closed. But a top mall really should have an influx of new and exciting stores all the time. So, that's one thing that I think a lot of times people get hung up on store closures. But the reality is that a lot of times those store closures are actually a good thing for the market because they invite new retailers in that might have a new idea about how to do things, or a new product, or an exciting new tech device. And ultimately, that can be good for the not only the overall market but for the consumers as well. So I guess that's a long way of saying that retail is ever changing. It's never going to stop evolving. It evolves very quickly, and it's always going to try to be on top of what we want out of it.
Wow. Thank you so much for your incredible retail insight, Brandon.
Thanks, Shanice. Yeah, thanks for having me here.
How can our listeners connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit. Brandon Isner on LinkedIn. That's where I'm at. That's probably the easiest way. I'm also on the Newmark website, so they can connect with me there. It's usually easiest through LinkedIn. And I usually a lot of the things that I was talking about. If there's something during the day that interests me, like I'll end up posting it online, and on LinkedIn, and sometimes that can spur conversations as well. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me.